Bond. James Bond. Those three simple words are arguably the most famous in screen history, kicking off a franchise that's lasted 58 years, 25 films, and 6 actors in the lead, and has grossed $7 billion to date, and arguably has shown more longevity than any other character in screen history, thanks to the ability of the franchise to both reinvent itself for new generations and the fact that it never loses sight of what made it so popular in the first place. So join us here at JoBlo as we look back at the history of the franchise, starting with the one that started it all in Bond Revisited, Dr. No. Flashback to the late 50s. Ian Fleming's James Bond was a literary sensation, and thoughts quickly turned to making it into a series of films. Fleming, along with a producer named Kevin McClory, pumped out a treatment which would later become the novel Thunderball, which didn't go anywhere, and throughout the decade, the closest thing we got to a Bond movie was an episode of CBS's Climax, starring Barry Nelson, best known as the guy who runs the Overlook in The Shining. In it, he plays an Americanized Jimmy Bond in Casino Royale.
Oh, you're a legend, old boy. Cod Sense Jimmy Bond, they call you. I knew you right away.
But then, something happened when President John F. Kennedy put From Russia with Love in his favorite books list, putting the character squarely in the zeitgeist, where he hasn't left ever since. At this point, a producer named Albert R. Broccoli and another man named Harry Saltzman split on the rights to form a company called Eon Productions. Eon stood for Everything or Nothing, and launched a series of Bond films starting with Dr. No. But who would play 007? Richard Burton was an option, but he said no, although they did get his brother to play the Q character, Major Boothroyd, in his first appearance. So did Cary Grant. Richard Johnson turned the role down too, although clearly regretted it, as a couple of years later he'd play Bulldog Drummond in Deadlier Than Male, big Bond clone if ever there was one.
So pretty, so frail. Gentlemen, beware. They're deadlier than the male.
Poor Mr. Wingard.
Patrick McGoohan said that he'd do it, but only if they cut down on the sex, and well, obviously that wasn't going to happen. But then, Broccoli saw a Disney movie called Darby O'Gill and the Little People, and saw something in its Scottish lead, a little-known actor named Sean Connery.
It makes a man feel like the Lord of the Castle.
A former Mr. Universe with a rough manner, tattoos, and very little hair, Broccoli nevertheless had faith Connery would make the ideal Bond, even if Fleming himself was unconvinced.
Here, on the set of Dr. No, Connery discusses with Ian Fleming some of the finer points of secret servicing.
To help him make the transition, Broccoli brought in director Terrence Young, a bon vivant who took Connery around to the best tailors, introduced him to the good life, and basically taught him to be suave. Young would direct the first modest James Bond outing, Dr. No. So how does it hold up?
I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
Basically, this is a private eye thriller. In it, Bond is sent to Kingston, Jamaica to get to the bottom of the murder of an MI6 associate named Strangways. It's pretty slow going for the first hour, with very little action considering what was to come next. Some of the choices here are downright bizarre, with an English actress named Zena Marshall as Miss Taro, the first Bond femme fatale, who, it has to be said, is wearing makeup to look Chinese.
Forgive me, book her, Superintendent, will you? And, be careful of her nail varnish.
Many have also complained about John Kitzmiller's performance as Quarrel, an islander who becomes Bond's assistant and plays to some pretty unfortunate racial stereotypes.
Fetch my shoes.
However, if you could overlook it, even this rough first half of the film has some excellent bits. One is a great scene where the baddies try to kill Bond with a tarantula, and it has to be said that Sean Connery was absolutely terrified of spiders, and you can actually see that the part with the tarantula, it's a glass partition between him and the spider, so the spider never touches him. That said, the terrified look on his face with the sweat wasn't just acting. And Bob Simmons, the man who would double for Connery in most of his fight scenes, and actually is the man in the gun barrel logo, is the one whose arm you see in close up. And Bob Simmons, for the record, said that it was one of the scariest stunts he ever did. Getting back to the gun barrel logo, yes, it's not Sean Connery, it is Bob Simmons. Connery himself had only ever filmed the gun barrel logo starting with 1965's Thunderball because the movie was shot in CinemaScope and the resolution was just too good. It would have been too obvious that it wasn't Sean Connery if they had kept the Bob Simmons opening. So there you go. In addition to the spider scene, there's also a great bit where Professor Dent, who's later revealed to be working in cahoots with the main villain Dr. No, tries to get one over on Bond, and Bond executes him in cold-blooded fashion, saying, "Like a Smith and Wesson, and you've just had your six." The on-location shooting also, it has to be said, is gorgeous with some real atmosphere, although Jack Lord's Felix Leiter is perhaps the second dullest version of the character ever to show up in a Bond movie, second only to Rick Van Nutter from Thunderball. It's amazing, but Jack Lord actually went on to one of the best careers of any of the other actors that played Felix Leiter, being the star of the long-running series Hawaii Five-0. And of course, the greatest thing about Dr. No is Sean Connery, who, at 32, was in his physical prime and is unbelievably menacing in the brief fight scenes. Now, on the topic of Sean Connery being bald, you might be surprised to learn that in Dr. No and From Russia with Love, he's actually not wearing a toupee. Yes, he was already balding by this point, but they were able to use some makeup to cover it up. In Goldfinger, however, the process had gone far enough that they had to outfit him in a wig. He would wear a wig for the rest of his tenure as Bond, and even wear a wig again as the middle-aged Bond in Never Say Never Again, which is a Bond story of its own that's just crazy that we'll get to in, well, I don't know, 13 episodes or so.
We're taking a 3-minute commercial break.
The movie really only comes to life in the second half when Bond and Quarrel infiltrate Crab Key, the mysterious island belonging to Dr. No. This is when the movie really starts to feel like a Bond film, mostly due to Ursula Andress as the first real Bond girl, Honey Rider. Andress, while dubbed, is likable as the childlike but self-educated Honey, and it has to be said she's drop-dead gorgeous.
Looking for shells?
No, I'm just looking.
Her introduction when she emerges from the surf in a bikini ranks with the most memorable of all time and was referenced with Halle Berry's entrance in the Brosnan-era film Die Another Day. Likewise, we also get a glimpse of our villain in the second half of the movie. Amazingly, he doesn't come into the film until an hour and 21 minutes into it. This villain, of course, is Dr. No, played by Joseph Wiseman, a Montreal native known for being an early method actor in movies like Viva Zapata. While wearing ethnic makeup, he's still chilling as the cool, calculated villain who intends to hijack NASA rockets and start World War III on behalf of his employer, Spectre, who, as all Bond fans will know, stands for Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terror, Revenge, and Extortion.
Usually when a man gets in my way.
So, let's break it down. As far as plot goes, Dr. No isn't anything special, and the pacing is pretty deadly in the first half, only to pick up in a big way once it passes the 1 hour mark. As far as Bond girls go, despite limited screen time, on the basis of sex appeal alone, you can't really do any better than Ursula Andress, although Honey Rider herself seems like a bit of a cartoon character. She would get higher marks if she'd come into the movie a little bit early on, and she'd been a little bit more of a well-rounded character, but I still give her a strong 7 on 10, and it has to be said, there are very few Bond girls that are quite as beautiful as Ursula Andress in this movie. Bond baddies also are a mixed bag. Dr. No really has a great look, and I love Wiseman's voice, but again, he's barely in the movie and seems a bit like a cartoon character come to life. I give him about a 7 on 10. For Bond music, this is where it gets a little bit complicated. The score is complex. It was composed by Monty Norman, and really is nothing special. It's just kind of jazzy wallpaper. I like the Kingston Trio songs, which add nicely to the atmosphere, and of course it's got kind of a theme song, I guess, in Underneath the Mango Tree, which is even sung by Sean Connery himself at one point in the movie.
Underneath the mango tree, my honey and me.
Yeah, so that was the only time that Sean Connery actually sung in a Bond movie, and, well, you can see why. Of course, there's the James Bond theme, which got its introduction in Dr. No, but who really wrote it? Everyone says it's Monty Norman, but that's a tricky question. Monty Norman may have technically written the film, but it was John Barry's orchestration that gave the theme its oomph, along with Maurice Binder's famous gun barrel opening, which was actually shot through a real gun barrel with a pinhole camera. To this day, it's used as the signature for the franchise. So in reality, the Bond music is kind of a product of several creators. The score itself would probably be about a 5, but the introduction of the Bond theme kicks it up to a 6. Things would get real in the next movie, From Russia with Love, when John Barry would take over the scoring duties. Bond gadgets are only about 2 on 10 because he gets nothing from Major Boothroyd, who would later be known as Q once Desmond Llewellyn comes on board. Like I said, it's Richard Burton's brother in this one, Peter. It's his one and only entry into the film, and Bond doesn't get anything besides his signature Walter PPK, which I suppose is something of a landmark moment, but no other gadgets in this one.
Walter PPK, 7.65 mil with a delivery like a brick through a plate glass window.
The Bond quips and one-liners aren't the best in this movie, although that one when he kills Dent
Mr. Smith and Wesson, you've had your 6.
is pretty badass. Now, the Bond humor in this movie is a bit of a disaster. There's a lot of goofy comic relief, and Young and the screenwriters trying to wring laughs out of Coral and Honey's perceived naivete has not aged well at all.
All right, then. We'll be back.
None of the following Bond films would ever be quite so tone-deaf, although I assume all involved learned their lesson. Years later, in Live and Let Die, they would try to redeem Coral by introducing his much more badass son, but more on that later. Bond action in this one is kinda tepid, although Connery, I have to say, throws one hell of a punch. All told, the body count adds up to a measly 4 kills by Bond. I mean, come on, Sean.
Clumsy effort, Mr. Bond. You disappoint me.
Overall, the first Bond film is a glorified B-movie, and only a hint of it was to come. The box office takings in the UK were huge. It was the top movie of the year, and in North America, the studio got $2 million back in rentals. A very positive start considering that the movie itself only cost $1 million. It was strong enough to guarantee a second film, which is where the Bond legend really began. As far as Dr. No goes, I give it a 6 on 10. It's not a great film, but the second half is fun, and it's worth seeing just because it introduces perhaps the most iconic screen hero of all time. But bigger and better things were to come. Until next time, for JoBlo.com, I'm Chris Bumbray.